An EKG is the electrical activity of the entire heart. Here we see the P wave, the QRS wave, and the T wave. This is the electrical activity of the entire heart. P, QRS, and T. The P wave represents atrial depolarization, which will be followed by atrial contraction. The QRS wave represents ventricular depolarization, and it will be followed by ventricular contraction. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization, and it will be followed by ventricular relaxation. Let's review. The P wave, which represents atrial depolarization, is followed by atrial systole, another word for contraction. The QRS wave, which represents ventricular depolarization, is followed by ventricular systole or contraction. The T wave, which represents ventricular repolarization, is followed by ventricular diastole or relaxation. Here is a normal ECG, P, QRS, and T, followed by another heartbeat. So that's normal. In people experiencing an anxiety attack, they feel as if their heart is fluttering. There is a skipped beat at times. This is called a premature ventricular contraction, which is shown in this ECG, where the QRS is upside down, which causes the heart flutter. The name for this kind of condition is called PVC, or premature ventricular contraction. Let's look at another abnormal ECG. Here we have a P, no QRS, another P, another P, and now the QRS and T. There seems to be too many P's. This is called a heart block, which means the SA node is firing but not sending the information to the AV node. There appears to be a block in the AV node. We call this the heart block. The next one here has something missing. It's the P. The P is missing, which means the SA node is not functional and the job has been taken up by the AV node. So the absence of P is shown by these red arrows. This person may have to have a pacemaker installed because the SA node activity is not happening. This is an example of a very abnormal ECG called fibrillation. The heartbeat is very chaotic in a fibrillation, and the heart rate can reach up to 300 beats per minute. Even though the heart does not go into tetanus at 300 beats per minute, it is not functional. The ventricles are unable to pump blood to the body or to the lungs. The only way to fix this problem is to use a defibrillator, which shocks the heart back into its normal rhythm. Before we go into the events that make up a single heartbeat, we need to look at the relationship between volume and pressure, which is basically Boyle's law. Pressure and volume are inversely proportional to each other. P is pressure here and V is volume. When volume increases, pressure decreases. That's what this formula means. When volume decreases, pressure increases. That's what we mean by inversely proportional. Now let's apply this to what happens in the heart. When the ventricles contract, the space inside the ventricles decreases. So imagine that you're in a place where there is less space. If there is less space, you feel more pressure. I like to think about it this way. It helps me to understand this relationship. Less space, more pressure. More space, less pressure. So, when ventricles contract, ventricular volume goes down and ventricular pressure goes up. So, let's see what happens when ventricles relax. When ventricles relax, there is more space. Ventricular volume increases. Imagine yourself inside the ventricle, lots of space. Then ventricular pressure decreases. You don't feel the pressure. The pressure decreases. One thing to remember here is that when we say volume, we mean space, not the amount of blood in the ventricles, but the space in the ventricles. A single heartbeat is also called a single cardiac cycle. Many events happen during this cardiac cycle, but we can summarize that into two major phases. Basically, two things happen and they all have to do with the ventricles. The ventricles relax fully and fill up with blood. We call this ventricular filling. So that's the first major phase of the cardiac cycle. Ventricles relaxing fully and filling up with blood. Imagine the ventricles as being two very large balloons, expanding and filling up with blood. The second stage is the ventricles contracting forcefully and ejecting the blood into the great arteries. So the second phase is contraction. First phase is relaxation. First phase is filling up with blood. Second phase, ejecting the blood. Now let's look at the micro events that take place during the cardiac cycle. We said that ventricles must relax. For that to happen, we have to have the T wave. The T wave is complete. Ventricular repolarization is complete. So we will start the ECG from the end of the T wave. So T wave is finished. Ventricular repolarization is complete. So now this will be followed by ventricular relaxation or diastole. So ventricles relax fully. And the fully is important. It's fully open. When that happens, the ventricular volume increases. Remember, we said when ventricles relax, there is more space. So ventricular volume increases. We have 3 arrows going up, which means it increases a lot. If that happens, ventricular pressure decreases a lot. So you have 3 arrows going down. The ventricular pressure is so low that it even falls below the pressure of the atria. Atria usually have very low pressure. Here the ventricular pressure has fallen below the atrial pressure. So when ventricular pressure is lower than atrial pressure, AV valves open, tricuspid and bicuspid. When these valves open, blood can flow from the atria to the ventricles, and the ventricles can fill up with blood. And this movement of blood occurs down the pressure gradient. Now we go back to the P wave. The P wave, as we know, represents atrial depolarization. The atrial depolarization is complete. This will be followed by atrial contraction or atrial systole. The atria will basically squeeze the blood so that it can go into the ventricles. When the atria contract, the atrial pressure is still higher than the pressure in the ventricles. So atrial pressure is greater than, there's the greater than sign, ventricular pressure. Atrial pressure is greater than ventricular pressure. So the AV valves are still open. No big changes here. Blood continues to flow from the atria to the ventricles down the pressure gradient. Now we move to QRS. The QRS is a very major event, so it happens in 2 parts. In this section, we will look at just when QRS begins. There are some events that follow. So when QRS begins, ventricular depolarization also just begins. This is followed by ventricular systole, but it just begins, which means the ventricles just contract just slightly. They just begin to contract. As a result, ventricular volume goes down ever so slightly. Slight contraction, so slight decrease in volume. We see that by a single arrow going down. As a result, ventricular pressure increases ever so slightly. There's your up arrow, one arrow only. When ventricular pressure increases, the ventricular pressure is greater than, there's your greater than sign, is greater than the atrial pressure. When that happens, we know that AV valves close. They make a sound. It's the lub sound. The heart has two sounds, lub, dub. So the lub sound comes from the AV valves closing. So there is no movement of blood. Blood does not flow anywhere, not from the atria to ventricles, and not from the ventricles to anywhere else. So no blood flows anywhere during this time. Here is the most dramatic event, QRS Complete. This means that ventricular depolarization is complete. Ventricular depolarization is followed by ventricular systole. So ventricles contract fully. The fully is important because it has an effect on ventricular volume. Ventricular volume decreases greatly because the ventricles contract fully. There's no space. So ventricular volume decreases greatly, which means ventricular pressure will increase greatly. Now that puts the ventricular pressure greater than pressure in the great arteries. When ventricular pressure is greater than the pressure in the great arteries, semilunar valves, which is aortic and pulmonary valve, they open. SL valves open. You want to imagine them like champagne corks opening. And blood is now ejected, like champagne. Blood is ejected from the ventricles to the great arteries. Even though it's going upwards, it is going down the pressure gradient. This means it's going from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure, from the ventricles to the great arteries. So now we have T wave. The T wave just begins, which means ventricular repolarization begins. Ventricular repolarization will be followed by ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation, but this also happens very slightly because the T wave just began. Ventricles relax slightly. As a result, ventricular volume goes up ever so slightly. There's a little bit more space, so the ventricular volume goes up slightly, one arrow going up. Correspondingly, ventricular pressure goes down slightly. Now, ventricular pressure is less than pressure in the great arteries. There's your lesser than sign. Then pressure in the great arteries. So SL valves close with a sound, the dub sound. We said that heart sound is lub dub. Lub is the closing of AV valves and dub is the closing of SL valves. All valves are closed, so no blood flows anywhere in the heart. Another way to represent the cardiac cycle is to use a graph. On the x-axis here we see ventricular volume of blood, This is the amount of blood that is inside the ventricle. The y-axis represents ventricular pressure. The four dots are the actions of the valves. The dot on the lower left corner is A, and that is AV valves open. B is AV valves close. C is SL valves open. And D is SL valves close. Between A and B is when the ventricles are filling up with blood, because at B, the AV valves close. The ventricular filling is complete. So from A to B represents ventricular filling. The second stage is B to C. At B, the ventricles are increasing in pressure, but all valves are closed and no blood is flowing anywhere. So the stage between B to C is called isovolumetric contraction. We know that C is the dramatic event when SL valves open. So from C to D is the ventricular ejection. At D, SL valves close, and so all valves are closed right now, but the pressure in the ventricle starts to go down because the ventricles are now relaxing. We call that isovolumetric relaxation. All of this together is one cardiac cycle. So at A, we have AV valves opening, ventricular filling begins. At B, AV valves close, ventricular filling ends, and isovolumetric contraction begins because the ventricular pressure starts to go up. At C, the pressure is so high that SL valves open, beginning the ventricular ejection. At D, SL valves close, which ends the ventricular ejection and begins the isovolumetric relaxation because the pressure starts to go down because the ventricles are relaxing. Here we have one full cardiac cycle. The volume of blood in the ventricle keeps changing. At B, at the end of ventricular filling, the ventricle has the maximum amount of blood. We call this end diastolic volume. During ventricular ejection, the volume of blood that leaves each ventricle is called stroke volume. At the end of ventricular ejection, which is D, the volume of blood that remains in the ventricle is called ESV, or end systolic volume. Let's review those blood volumes. EDV, end diastolic volume. This is the blood that is collected in the ventricles at the end of ventricular filling. So it is the maximum amount of blood that is in the ventricle during a single cardiac cycle. The next volume is stroke volume. Stroke volume is the volume of blood that leaves the ventricle during each heartbeat. It has to be the same on both sides. Each ventricle has its own stroke volume and they have to be equal. So here we have it. Stroke volume is the volume of blood leaving the ventricle during a single heartbeat. ESV, end systolic volume. This is the blood that remains. You gathered a bunch of blood, you ejected it, whatever remains is ESV. So ESV is basically EDV minus SV. So this is the volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after ventricular ejection.